Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, Episode 76, Battle for the Sans-Culottes, Part 1. In the last episode, the friend of the people was murdered in a bathtub. In this episode, we're going to see the struggle to claim not only Marat's legacy, but the revolution itself. With the Girondin deputies finally purged, it's time for the capital's radicals to turn upon themselves. From the emergence of a new ultra-radical faction to the last great rising of the Sans-Culottes, the events of the next few episodes shape so much of the terror to come. But before we get into it, a quick reminder that I need your help. It takes a tremendous amount of work to bring you this podcast, and I can't do it alone. By donating just a cup of coffee when main episodes are first released, you can do your part to keep Grey History on the air. From bonus content to ad-free listening, you can enjoy a whole range of exclusive community perks, not to mention those warm fuzzy feelings for knowing that you're helping to create history that isn't black and white. So please follow the links in the show notes or on the website and join the community today. Now, it's with great pleasure that I get to welcome the newest members of the Grey History community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Radu, Nikita, Victor, Nick, Murray, Gretchen, Guapo, David, Bass, Pete, and Anna-R737. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, David, Colin, Orr, Ned, and XYZ. Additionally, a special thank you to both Mike and Evelyn for increasing their pledge and joining the True Revolutionaries. Speaking of special thank yous, a tremendous thank you to the amazing champions of the people, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Carl, Jeff, Regis, Hannah, Tyrone, Cameron, Britt, Dan, and Paul. Finally, one revolutionary-sized thank you to the heroes of the revolution, the great of the greats, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Fernando, Hilberto, Ron, and Kevin S. As always, thank you to every member of the community, and thank you to those helping Grey History in any other way, such as sharing the show with friends and family. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. On the 13th of July, 2024, Donald J. Trump narrowly survived an assassination attempt. Believe it or not, this near miss offers a surprising parallel to events we're covering in the French Revolution. For starters, the assassination attempt occurred on Saturday, the 13th of July, the very same day Jean-Paul Marat was slain 231 years before. But, more importantly, recent events allow us to better comprehend the political ramifications of Marat's downfall. To digress for a moment, I want you to imagine the political fallout had Trump been less fortunate. Specifically, how the Republican Party would have gone about selecting an alternative presidential nominee. The process would have been shambolic. Contemplate just how many people could have tried to win the nomination. For starters, you have the obvious contenders, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. Haley, a former governor, could at least claim to have won millions of votes in the Republican primary, totaling about 20% of ballots cast. Yet, that very fact is a double-edged sword. with some 80% of Republican voters having rejected her candidacy, Haley's second-place finish would have just as easily undermined her position. Then you have Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Popular amongst some elements of the party, the governor of America's third most populous state would certainly make a case. Yet, here again, detractors would voice doubts. His primary performance was disappointing at best, and it's clear that some Republicans would be reluctant to back his candidacy. But if not Haley, nor DeSantis, then who? Mike Pence, Trump's former vice president, remains in political purgatory. Furthermore, back on the 13th of July, J.D. Vance, Trump's new pick for vice president, had not yet received the endorsement. Sure, Vance may still have had a go. He was on the shortlist after all, but so too were more experienced and better connected candidates. Now, I don't wish to dwell on this analogy any longer, as I'm sure you're starting to see my point. In the event that the self-styled friend of the people had been killed on the 13th of July, a divisive and bruising struggle would have been the most probable outcome. With no heir apparent and significant rewards for the victor, the intra-party contest between competing ideologies and personalities would have been both brutal and bitter. And it's here, in a brutal and bitter struggle, that we find the key parallel to events in Paris in 1793. While it should not be taken too literally, this thought experiment helps us to better understand the political realities of Marat's unexpected demise. Now, unlike Trump, Marat was not the near unrivaled standard-bearer of a political movement. Across the Jacobins alone, there was Robespierre and Danton, while further afield, those associated with the Enraged and other ultra-radicals had their own emerging leaders. But Marat was an influential and popular figure. He was a capable speaker and journalist, and perhaps most importantly, he was the only revolutionary leader who spanned almost all the institutions of the Parisian revolutionary left, with supporters amongst the Convention, the Commune, the sections, multiple political clubs, and the Sans-Culottes themselves. Marat was connected to a swathe of institutions and movements in a way that others could only dream. Danton lacked support in the Paris Commune. The Enraged were loathed in the Convention. Even Robespierre, who held court in both the Jacobin Club and the National Convention, had far less influence over the Cordelier Club and the Commune. However, Marat had ties to them all. This is why the absence of an often ostracised deputy still left such a mark. Combined with the existing contests between the revolution's various factions, and what you have in mid-1793 was the perfect storm for renewed factional struggle. As Corday had slain her victim, the race to replace Marat had begun. In the emerging battle to lead the radical revolutionary left, the first faction to note is the Enraged. For a while now, we've seen this grassroots movement play an increasingly influential role in Parisian politics. In the first half of 1793, the Enraged had achieved considerable success. Although an early attempt to purge the Girondins had failed in March, the despised deputies were ultimately removed less than 3 months later on the 2nd of June. Here, enraged leaders had been critical to this successful insurrection. Likewise, in addition to political victories, the Enraged had been racking up the scoreboard when it came to their social and economic priorities. Once upon a time, the Jacobins were in lockstep with the Gironde, defending private property and championing more liberal economic principles. even as late as March 1793, in the wake of the so-called soap and sugar riots, Montagnard leaders had overwhelmingly condemned the ultra-radicals, who they blamed for promoting unrest and extremism. However, yet again, success had followed setbacks, and the Mountain had proceeded to adopt much of the ultra-radical agenda. By April, even Robespierre was lobbying for a fundamental reframing of property rights, proposing that individual rights be subordinated to the needs of society more broadly. Furthermore, price controls on grain had been officially introduced, even if their proper implementation remained lacking. So, if one was to evaluate the fortunes of the radical Sans-Culottes movement in mid-1793, one would see considerable success. But that success was not to last. From the perspective of the Enraged, the purging of the Girondins was the start, not the end. Advocating various political, social, and economic reforms, the removal of Brissot and his allies was just the first step. With the Gironde no longer an obstacle, it was time for the Jacobins to prove themselves as the true champions of the people. If they refused, the people would lead themselves. Yet, the newly reduced convention had no intention of simply complying with the radicals in the streets. Many Jacobins were ideologically opposed to the Enraged program, and some had even resisted the forced expulsion of their Girondin peers. Consequently, their resistance to the emboldened ultra-radicals was both fierce and immediate. Nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in the final contents of the Constitution of 1793. If we start with the political demands of the Enraged, it's perhaps best to focus on the ideas of Jean-François Varlet. We first met Varlet when he was arrested by the infamous Commission of 12, and he subsequently played a key role in organising the insurrections of 31 May and 2 June. It was the latter which succeeded in finally purging the Girondin deputies. Yet, perhaps more importantly, we also met Varlet in episode 74 on the new Constitution. It was Varlet who emerged as the most vocal champion of direct democracy, and in the Jacobin Constitution, Varlet found much to despise. Now, it's true to say that the Jacobins had inserted aspects of pure democracy as concessions to the radicalizing Sans-Culottes movement. For example, deputies would be directly elected by universal male suffrage, and indirect elections were introduced for the new Executive Council as well. But at its core, the Constitution retained a representative and in many ways parliamentary system. This was unacceptable. As we heard in episode 74, Varlet had demanded unlimited power to the sovereign people. According to Varlet, the people should meet regularly to directly elect all public officials. Likewise, the people should deliberate on all matters of interest, sanction all laws, and bind their representatives with mandates forcing them to vote in certain manners. This was what unlimited power would look like in practice, and only direct democracy could avoid the corruption and tyranny of parliamentary systems. While many historians would consider these demands unworkable, that didn't change the demands, nor their exclusion from the new constitution. With the Jacobins embracing what was largely a parliamentary system as the bedrock of the new republic, the Enraged had suffered a terrible ideological setback. But in some ways, this was the lesser defeat. If we turn our attention to economic and social matters, we see a more stinging and consequential rebuke. A rebuke centered on private property. If Varley is the enraged leader historians associate with direct democracy, Roux is the evangelist of severe economic controls. Jacques Roux, who some historians label the Red Priest, is debatably the most iconic and recognisable of all the enraged activists. A constitutional cleric who had been elected to the Paris Commune in 1792, Roux had become a vocal champion of the downtrodden. Advocating aggressive price controls and severe measures against speculation and hoarding, Roux's signature demand was the prompt execution of all who profited from the misfortunes of the nation. For members of the Grey history community, you may want to refresh yourself with Roux's history by listening to episode extra 56.1, The Red Priest. Now, if Varley was unsatisfied with how the new constitution incorporated the unlimited sovereignty of the people, well, Jacques Roux was seething with rage as to how it handled property rights. At the end of episode 74, I flagged that the new Constitution of 1793 had maintained property as a natural and imprescriptible right. Furthermore, according to the revised Declaration of Rights, government was instituted to guarantee the enjoyment of that right, along with equality, liberty, and security. This was a catastrophic blow. Sure, the aim of society was now the common welfare, but how was this to be achieved? How could the happiness of the people be secured when the Constitution had enshrined property as a natural and imprescriptible right? How was equality to be established and the greater good attained when it ignored the limitations on property that the enraged had long thought necessary? Having advocated for sweeping price controls, the Constitution had none. Having sought harsh punishments for speculators and hoarders, the Constitution had none. Having pleaded for the forced requisitions of food and goods to meet the needs of the people, the Constitution had none. Not even Robespierre's proposal to subordinate individual property rights to the needs of society had made the final cut. The enraged had been rebuffed. But worse, the people had been betrayed. At a time when food shortages were increasing the people's misery, at a time when inflation was running unchecked, at a time when foreign and civil war threatened every aspect of one's life and security, the Constitution seemed woefully inadequate. Starved by aristocrats, exploited by profiteers, menaced by counter-revolutionaries, what were the people to do? Once more, the Sans-Culottes would rise, and the enraged would lead the charge. Perceiving the Jacobins to be betraying the people they claimed to represent, a new struggle to lead the revolutionary left erupted with unprecedented speed. On the 25th of June, just one day after the Constitution's acceptance, Roux himself appeared before the National Convention. Representing his section and associated with both the Paris Commune and the radical Cordelet Club, the tirade Roux unleashed was almost unbelievable. "100 times this sacred precinct has echoed with the crimes of egotists and scoundrels. You have repeatedly promised to strike the bloodsuckers of the people. The Constitutional Act is going to be presented for the sanction of the sovereign. And have you prescribed speculation? No. Have you pronounced the death sentence on hoarders? No. Have you determined what is freedom of trade? No. Have you prohibited the sale of coined silver? No. Well, we declare to you that you have not done everything for the happiness of the people. In the speech that followed, a speech that history records as the Manifesto of the Enraged, Roux tore shreds off the deputies of the mountain, warning that freedom and equality were nothing when the rich could starve others with impunity. The renegade priest demanded aggressive and uncompromising measures. Death to monopolists, death to speculators, death to hoarders, bloodsuckers and counter-revolutionaries. Price controls, forced requisitions, unlimited measures to save the poor, the hungry, the needy, the downtrodden. That is what the people wanted. That is what the nation required. Worryingly for the deputies, Roux did not mince his words. Unloading on the men before him, he accused the representatives of cowardice and betrayal. Depicting the convention as the allies of bankers and monopolists, his calls for reforms doubled as threats. Proclaiming that the Sans-Culottes stood ready with their pikes to execute the convention's decrees, the insinuation was clear. They also stood ready to execute the convention. No one had forgotten that just 3 weeks prior, the ultra-radicals had compelled the body to purge the Girondin deputies. This despite the fact that many Montagnards, including Danton, had actively worked against the insurrection's aims. But in case the Jacobins hadn't got the message that the Sans-Culottes were ready to cast them aside if they failed to meet their immediate demands, Roux continued to wage his campaign. Shortly afterwards, the prominent activist repeated his accusations before delegates of the city's 48 sections. Here he was warmly received, and the threat to the convention was all the more clear. By now, some radicals were becoming increasingly agitated. Some were even demanding insurrection. As one sans-culotte put it, "I am indignant that the people are talking about petitions when it is necessary to arm themselves with cannons and daggers. Stand up then, and if we have only made clear water in the days of May 31, let this new insurrection be written in the annals of history in characters of blood. We need an August 10. We need the heads of the scoundrels to fall." As historian Albert Maty notes, this call for bloody insurrection was greeted with long and noisy applause. With the mountain facing a renewed challenge to its leadership of the Sans-Culottes, the actions of the Enraged could not go ignored. This was a declaration of war, both on the convention and its Jacobin leadership. The result was the full mobilization of the Jacobin Club. In the popular societies, the Commune, the Convention, and the press, the Jacobins let loose. The Enraged were brainless intriguers, clever rogues, false patriots promoting extreme positions. According to the Mountain, Roux and his allies were even more dangerous than aristocrats and royalists. With the rhetoric escalating, Robespierre warned of the 3 chief enemies jeopardizing the safety of the state: Austria and Spain, Pitt and the émigrés, and finally, Jacques Roux. French historian Daniel Guérin, himself a 20th century revolutionary known for his groundbreaking advocacy of libertarian Marxism, recalls these events. Note that Guérin's personal beliefs do result in considerable sympathy for the embattled Enraged. Jacques Roux's greatest success had been in the Cordelier Club, and it was there, above all, that he had to be discredited. The Jacobins delegated no fewer than 12 speakers to go along. All their star performers were mobilized. Robespierre, Culotte d'Arbois, Jacques Hébert, and so on. Everything was planned in advance. One after the other, the speakers did their duty and slung their bit of mud at Jacques Roux and at Théophile Leclerc, who had courageously taken up his defence. Culotte d'Arbois called him an agent of fanaticism, crime and treachery. Leclerc was accused of being a fugitive from Coblentz in the pay of Pitt. Jacques Roux wanted to reply, but the crowd made such an uproar that he was unable to make himself heard. In the end, Jacques Roux was expelled from the Cordelier, along with Leclerc, hounded like a villain, a fanatic, a monster. The famous petition he had read to the convention was disowned. On 1 July, the General Council of the Commune, bearing in mind that citizen Jacques Roux had been expelled from the popular societies for his unpatriotic opinions, unanimously condemned his behaviour. It was Marat who dealt the final blow. The hapless Jacques Roux, spurned on all sides, appeared in The Friend of the People as a grasping schemer who had taken up with extremism, whipping up intensity of feeling, and taken patriotism to its wildest extremes. The Jacobin leader's prestige was still high among the Sans-Culottes, and the slanders had their effect. Having dared to challenge the mountain, the Enraged were smothered in a landslide. Encapsulating the merciless and multi-pronged attack, Marat denounced Roux as a fraud, a liar, a monster, a notorious criminal, and an immoral priest. This was how Marat characterized the man who had once sheltered him from the authorities in mid-1791 in the wake of the Champ de Mars massacre and the Tricolour Terror. Repudiated by political clubs, the Paris Commune, and even members of his own section, it appeared that Jacques Roux was on the precipice of defeat. The Enraged were seemingly crushed. And then, they weren't. In the middle of 1793, the ultra-radicals stormed back. Surprisingly, events began to turn in their favour with the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat on the 13th of July. Given the recent feuds between the two men, Roux had initially been arrested as a possible suspect, complicit in the grand conspiracy which no doubt guided Corday's actions. Remember, for the men of the 18th century, Charlotte Corday could not have been acting alone, and Roux was quickly cleared in favour of Girondin conspirators. Historian Robert Barry Rose notes that at this moment, Roux's destruction as a revolutionary was almost complete. But it's here that the Red Priest made one last stand. With Marat removed from the political arena, the Jacobins had lost one of their most popular and radical leaders. The Enraged were determined to fill the void. Deciding to fight fire with fire, Roux took to the press. Within days of Marat's death, the priest had released a new publication titled The Publicist of the French Republic, by the shade of Marat, the friend of the people. The title says it all. Despite the recent acrimony between the two men, Roux was writing as the ghost of Marat. The radical was determined to seize Marat's mantle. So too was Théophile Leclerc, another enraged leader who Marat had just denounced as a rogue linked to the Federalist Rebellion in Lyon. Like Roux, Leclerc had led the campaign against both the Constitution and its Jacobin creators. Leclerc would later distance himself from Roux, and the organic, grassroots nature of the Enraged movement should not give the impression that they were anywhere near as coordinated as either the Jacobins or the Girondins. That said, Roux and Leclerc were singing from the same hymn sheet, and Leclerc's tactics were equally brazen. Entitling his new publication, Leclerc called it Friend of the People, plagiarism at its finest. Considering Marat's paper was The Friend of the People, Leclerc's Friend of the People was somehow an even more blatant seizure of Marat's legacy than Roux's attempt to write as his ghost. However, newspapers aside, circumstances beyond their control unexpectedly bolstered the sudden resurgence of the Enraged. Although the Federalist rebellions to the north were already beginning to crumble, the Norman departments had barred the transportation of food to Paris. With the situation in the Vendée worsening, and the Federalist rebellions of Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux gaining steam, the capital was gripped, yet again, by hunger and fear. The result was renewed riots and calls for extreme economic measures. These were the perfect conditions for the return of the Enraged. Armed with new publications and claims to Marat's legacy, the ultra-radicals went on the attack. Roux openly accused the Mountain of doing nothing for the Sans-Culottes, while the convention was portrayed once more as the allies of bankers and profiteers. Demanding the eradication of hoarding and the introduction of price controls, the Enraged warned clearly that the counter-revolution would triumph by the starvation of the people. For a rioting populace both hungry and afraid, Roux was the hero of the hour. Thus, despite the coordinated assault to discredit the Enraged, the Jacobins had missed their mark. The priest was back. With him was the fire and brimstone of a starving people. Historian Albert Merty writes as to the importance of the developing situation. There was competition among the popular leaders, Leclerc, Jacques Roux, and Varlet, as to who was to take the place of Marat, who, while he was alive, had denounced their counter-revolutionary exaggerations. As early as July 16, Jacques Roux hastened to bring out a continuation of Marat's newspaper, to which he boldly gave the title Publicist to the French Republic by the shade of Marat, Friend of the People. Young Leclerc was roused to emulation. On July 20, he started issuing The Friend of the People, the title of which was borrowed from Marat's first newspaper. The Enraged, who had hitherto possessed no press organ of their own, now owned two. Leclerc hastened to denounce the commercial aristocracy. In his eyes, the high price of food was the result of a plot on the part of the rich. He denounced the robbers of the public, enjoying the fruits of their plunder under the protection of the law, and expressed his surprise that the patient and kindly people did not fall upon this handful of assassins. He demanded that speculators in necessary commodities should be punished by death. To put it simply, the faction menace had returned to Paris. While the Girondins had been vanquished from the capital, new divisions had emerged amongst the revolutionary left. Between Brissot and the Gironde, and Roux and the Enraged, the Jacobins were besieged on all sides, as various republican groupings battled for supremacy. But while this is where we will leave the Enraged for this episode, it is not where we will leave the ultra-radical Sans-Culottes. As any student of revolutions will tell you, just when you think there's enough factions, there's always room for one more. In the weeks preceding Marat's assassination on the 13th of July, a new ultra-radical faction, distinct from the Enraged, was coming to the fore. Like every other group in the French Revolution, this camp goes by multiple names, just to make it all the more challenging. Eventually, this faction will often be called the Ultras, as in ultra-revolutionary or extremist, but such a title is particularly confusing while the Enraged are still on the scene. As such, until further notice, I will refer to this group exclusively by their other common title, the Hébertists. Yet, before we can understand the emerging Hébertists, we should probably have a more proper introduction to their namesake, Jacques Hébert. Born in 1757, Hébert was 35 by the time the Girondins were purged in mid-1793. The son of a master goldsmith with ties to the local municipality, Hébert was by no means born into the working poor. He had garnered a solid education and at one point aimed to obtain a career in law. Unfortunately, it was not to be. His father's early death, a messy love affair, and a hefty fine for slander all cut short his legal pursuits. Hébert was soon adrift. Moving to Paris in 1780, it was there he lived in poverty, taking odd jobs and begging in between. However, the outbreak of the revolution changed everything, particularly for an ambitious, driven, and capable wordsmith. Like many others, Hébert found his place in the revolutionary press. Popularity followed. Hébert's most consequential publication was the political newspaper Le Père Duchesne. In it, Hébert took the persona of Father Duchesne, a stereotypical sans-culotte figure who both embodied and protected the people. Writing as if he was the patriotic sans-culotte, Hébert promoted revolutionary radicalism and denounced counter-revolutionary intrigue. Compared to Marat, Hébert's work shared similarities and differences. In terms of substance, both advocated severe crackdowns on the reactionary nobility and clergy, and both promoted Jacobin policies and sans-culotte interests. However, because of Hébert's persona as Father Duchesne, his works were written in a fundamentally different style. Hébert's paper matched the supposed author. As such, Hébert's words were not particularly elegant, but what they lacked in rhythm, they made up for in humour, intensity, violence, and most noticeably, vulgarity. I would only be exaggerating slightly if I were to tell you that Hébert dropped the F-bomb every second word. With his newspaper both captivating and approachable, by the time of Marat's assassination, only Hébert could rival the famous journalist in terms of popularity and reach. It's for this reason that Hébert was another potential successor to Marat's legacy. But before we get to Hébert's claims to be the true heir of Marat, we must note his political career. Like Marat, Hébert had capitalized on his popularity to launch a successful entrance into politics. However, despite their similarities, Hébert had chosen a different path to power. While Marat had decided to enter the National Convention, Hébert had instead won election to the Paris Commune. By 1793, he specifically held the post of Deputy Procureur, a senior position within the municipality. Surrounded by like-minded figures and armed with his mighty publication, Hébert sought to push the revolution by applying pressure on the gridlocked convention. As the Jacobins and the Girondins battled to control the national government, the Paris Commune continued to advocate various popular measures, including enraged policies like the price maximum on grain. As they did so, the Girondins warned incessantly that the capital's municipality had forgotten its constitutional place. By late May, Hébert found himself at the epicenter of national events. You may recall that it was the arrest of Jacques Hébert, along with the enraged activist Jean-François Varlet, which had caused so much uproar in the capital at the Girondin Commission of 12. Within a week, both Varlet and Hébert were free, and they would go on to coordinate the insurrection of 31 May and succeed in purging the Girondins just 2 days later. So, in the aftermath of the Girondin downfall, Hébert and his associates were already on the rise. As masters of the Paris Commune, their influence was considerable. But the assassination of Marat soon offered numerous opportunities. As the author of the only publication that could rival The Friend of the People, as a senior member of the Parisian municipality, and as a popular figure amongst the Sans-Culottes, Hébert had the perfect opportunity to emerge as a new revolutionary leader. However, while we will continue to see Hébert's rise for many episodes, there are some immediate questions we need to answer right now. Firstly, in our prior exploration of the Jacobin attack against Jacques Roux, we've already seen the involvement of Jacques Hébert. This begs the question: why? Why were the Hébertists, a ultra-radical faction, attacking the Enraged, another ultra-radical faction? Why were these champions of the people engaged in political struggles and not uniting against the more moderate Jacobin cohorts? Secondly, given that there were evidently differences between the Enraged and the Hébertists, what were those differences? Were they ideological, or were other factors at play? Finally, we need to examine the strongholds of Hébertist support, not just in the Commune or the press, but in, of all places, the War Ministry. Once we've done that, we will be ready to see the existential struggle to lead the Sans-Culottes, and by association, the revolution more broadly. At first glance, the Enraged and the Hébertists look incredibly similar. Both considered themselves ultra-radical champions of the Sans-Culotte movement, and both had supporters in the sections and the Commune. So, what's the difference? Well, like the Girondins and the Jacobins at the start of the National Convention, it should be noted that there were indeed considerable similarities. However, distinctions can be made, and that's before you add feuds, rivalries, and personal ambitions. In terms of ideological differences, there are 2 key points to note for now. The first relates to foreign policy and the Revolutionary War. The second relates to private property and the associated implications for severe economic interventions. Let's start with foreign policy. For some historians, the Enraged were exclusively focused on domestic matters. Historian Albert Maty, for example, argues that the Enraged did not see beyond the social program and that the problem of poverty absorbed all of their activity. Consequently, Maty states that the Enraged had no foreign policy. This in itself is not necessarily a criticism and can be seen as a confirmation that Roux and his allies were authentic advocates of the people's immediate needs. But if the war was not a primary concern for the Enraged, it was for the Hébertists. Like the Girondins of 1792, the Hébertists of 1793 were enthusiastic proponents of revolutionary war. If the Girondins had once spoken of toppling kings and queens and of creating sister republics in Poland and Naples, it was now the Hébertists who espoused war to the bitter end. Furthermore, while the Girondins had balked at the illiberal measures required to win the escalating struggle, the Hébertists were different. They were willing to do what must be done. Total victory required total war, and total war required the sorts of policies which horrified the Gironde. Price maximums, forced requisitions, compulsory use of the paper currency assignat. These were economic measures, yes, but they were nonetheless critical in their battle with Europe. Importantly, these were the exact sort of policies advocated by the Enraged as they sought to relieve poverty and hunger. Yet, if the Hébertists differed from the Enraged in their focus on the Revolutionary War, that still leaves a question. Why? Why did foreign matters preoccupy one ultra-radical faction and not the other? In some ways, this is an unanswerable question, but historians offer various proposals. One factor influencing their outlook was probably its leading members. Now, once again, I must caution against thinking of these groups as anything like modern political parties. The Hébertists were not a disciplined parliamentary organisation or political club, nor was Jacques Hébert the unquestioned leader of a popular movement. That said, it is true that certain individuals were more prominent than others. Of these, several leading figures were foreigners, who openly embraced the armed liberation of their homeland. Take, for example, the Prussian nobleman Sans-Culottes. Like Thomas Paine, the foreign revolutionary had been elected to the National Convention, and here he advocated extreme measures and total war. Another example would be Jean Conrad de Kock. A banker and revolutionary, the Dutch exile had helped to found the Batavian Revolutionary Committee. From Paris, he energetically pursued the salvation of the Netherlands and was bitterly disappointed by French setbacks in 1793. In short, it's argued by some historians that the prominence of foreign activists amongst this ultra-radical group played a role in their uncompromising pursuit of total victory. However, most Hébertists were French, and so this liberation explanation can only go so far. An alternative theory centres on the same motivations which spurred the Girondins to first campaign for war in 1792: ideology. For many Hébertists, an imperfect peace was itself defeat. Anything short of total victory was equivalent to restoration and counter-revolution. In this war between the old world and the new, only one could succeed. Summarizing these various perspectives, historian Albert Maty writes, Hébert was above all for war to the bitter end, or till a complete victory had been gained. He could not imagine any peace policy that was not at the same time a policy of monarchist restoration. Cloutes, who desired to push back the frontiers of France as far as the Rhine, seconded him with all his might. He later writes, If they wanted all-out war, it was not only out of patriotic pride, but the conviction that a premature peace would be fatal to the revolution and would kill the democratic republic. It was also out of self-interest, of course. Many of them were political refugees who came to France to seek not only salvation for their persecuted heads, but the means to deliver their homeland from monarchical and feudal oppression. In short, one key difference between the Hébertists and the Enraged was the former's support for the Revolutionary War. For despotism to be vanquished and for liberty to be guaranteed, the French would need to win a complete and uncompromising victory. Anything else was merely disguising a defeat. Yet, Another key difference between the two ultra-radical factions relates to economic and social policies. While few historians question the genuine advocacy of the Enraged, the Hébertists are another matter entirely. For example, French historian Daniel Guérin praises the Enraged as the direct and true interpreters of the mass movement. But such warmth does not extend to the Hébertists. Far from sincere activists, Guérin sees the Hébertists as greedy intriguers, harnessing the popular movement to further their own ambitions. Although he concedes their republican convictions, he asserts that their revolutionary faith was mixed up with their own material desires. Similar sentiments, at least for the Enraged, can be found in the work of the English scholar Robert Barry Rose. Rose also describes the Enraged favourably, stating that Roux and his allies are clearly entitled to be ranked among the founders of the democratic and revolutionary traditions of the modern French working class. Notably, Rose highlights that Jacques Roux viewed the Hébertists as cynical profiteers who adopted Sans-Culottes slogans in order to build a private empire of power and profit. Thus, Roux' personal opinions match the conclusions of historian Daniel Guérin centuries later. However, the fact that Jacques Roux slandered his competition is not exactly surprising. I mean, he denounced the entire convention as the friends of monopolists, so a critique of Hébert is hardly a revelation. Likewise, historian Guérin was a 20th century revolutionary. A proponent of anarchism, it's not shocking that someone with his beliefs views the decentralized grassroots activism of the Enraged rather favorably. But historians with very different ideological backgrounds come to similar conclusions. Agreeing with this rather dim view of Hébertist motivations is historian Marisa Linton. Linton, an expert in the development of the terror, notes, "The factional activities of the Hébertist leaders were as much about personal power politics and frustrated ambition as they were about sympathy for the economic plight of the ordinary people of Paris." So, another potential difference between the Enraged and the Hébertists is their genuine ideological commitment to radical social programs advocated by the Sans-Culottes movement. While some scholars question the wisdom of Enraged policies, even conservative and revisionist historians are generally willing to portray them as sincere believers in the reforms they championed. The same cannot be said for the Hébertists. Now, to be clear, the majority of historians are not questioning their political convictions. The Hébertists were staunchly Republican, and Hébert was openly Republican long before many of his peers. But as it relates to social and economic matters, scholars are less convinced. Like the deputies of the mountain, Hébert had initially resisted the extreme measures advocated by the Enraged. For example, Hébert had once rejected sweeping price controls on all sorts of basic necessities. The exact measures so popular with many sans-culottes. Now, it's possible that he just changed his mind. But given his initial opposition to policies that the Enraged genuinely believed in, historians tend to conclude that part of the reason the Hébertists eventually adopted much of the Enraged social program was for political benefits, rather than sincere ideological beliefs. This is a process we will see next episode as the two factions engage in existential struggle and the Hébertists embrace increasingly radical positions. Now, to be fair to the Hébertists, the adoption of popular policies without sincere convictions would make them no different to many successful politicians. Furthermore, before Jacobin sympathisers get all high and mighty, we have already seen Montagnards do the exact same thing. Earlier in 1793, we saw the moving of the mountain, where the Jacobins had adopted some ultra-radical policies to ensure their own place as the leaders of the Revolutionary Republic. While some Jacobins genuinely shifted their views, many were adhering to the politics of necessity. Nowhere is this more clearly seen than in the stark example of the mountain paying lip service to the people's needs. For all of Robespierre's genuine talk of subordinating property rights to the needs of society, the majority of Montagnard deputies were all too keen to enshrine imprescriptible property rights in the Constitution of 1793. So, one can argue that it's not unreasonable that the Hébertists would do the same, adopting much of the social and economic policies of the Enraged in order to remain relevant to the Sans-Culottes movement. It was an added benefit that they genuinely believed that some of those policies would help win the Revolutionary War, such as forcing farmers to sell grain at fixed prices and in exchange for the revolution's paper currency. Yet, the issue I'm highlighting here is that of sincerity, specifically as it relates to the radical program first articulated by the Enraged. For some historians, a distinction can be made between the Hébertists and the Enraged in terms of their genuine commitment to radical social programs. While the Enraged are generally portrayed as true believers motivated exclusively by the hardships of the people, the same cannot be said for the standard depiction of the Hébertists. However, before we wrap up, I want to point out both an extension to this argument and a rebuttal. Firstly, if you tease out this accusation of the Hébertists adopting policies for personal, political, and financial benefits, there are profound implications for their commitment to the Revolutionary War. We've already heard some historians express their genuine belief that ideology played a key role in the embrace of complete and uncompromising victory. But what if something else was at play? As mentioned earlier, Hébert's like-minded associates drew strength from the Commune, the sections, and the popular societies, particularly the Cordeliers Club. However, they also drew strength from the War Ministry. From mid-1793, the War Minister was a gentleman named Jean-Baptiste Bouchet. Bouchet was an associate of the broader Hébertist faction, as were many officials in his orbit. So, what if the driver for revolutionary war was not ideology, but rather self-interest? Total war meant the total empowerment of the Hébertist War Ministry. It meant more funds, more power, more prestige, more opportunities to amass positions and profits. Considering the preeminence of Hébertist officials, continued conflict was a boon for some ultra-radicals. Historian Daniel Guérin summarizes the suspicions, or in his case, accusations, of many scholars and contemporaries. They fought energetically and persistently for the sans-culottisation of the army and the war ministry, not only as protection against the serious threat posed to the Republic by reactionary officers and officials, but also because they were eager to take over their positions themselves. So, some historians see self-interest intermingled with the radical policies of the Hébertists. Of course, there are risks when speaking of a group which is so loose that the word faction is considered by some to be too strong a word. As we've seen previously with the Girondins, individual actors might work together, but their ideas and motivations were by no means homogeneous nor clear-cut. Yet, despite the limitations and caveats of talking about any revolutionary grouping as a single bloc, the issue of motivation remains. Is it coincidental that a faction routinely defined as ambitious adopted a policy platform that would see a significant increase in their prominence, power, and potentially wealth? Possibly, but possibly not. However, before we wrap up, I would be negligent if I did not note that some scholars reject this dour and pessimistic view of the Hébertists. It's true to say that the Hébertists are one of the least loved factions of the revolutionary era, and as we continue, we'll see arguments both for and against their conduct. But Hébert does have his defenders, and perhaps the most important one was the 19th century French revolutionary Gustave Troudon. Starting in the 1860s, Troudon wrote a groundbreaking work that essentially rehabilitated Hébert's reputation. Some historians are critical of its value, but it nevertheless represents a turning point for how some scholars evaluate Hébert. For Troudon, the Commune of 1793 was to be celebrated, and it was not Hébert or his associates who were the villains of the Terror. Instead, the Hébertists were pure and noble citizens, patriots who had been defamed by the hypocritical formulas of lesser men. Well versed in hardship and committed to beliefs that undermined the moderation of the revolution, their eventual demise was a cause of sorrow, not celebration. Now, the point of this episode is not for you to reach your own conclusions on Hébert and his comrades. We've only just met them. Instead, it's to appreciate the conflicting interpretations of their actions. Henceforth, as we explore the controversies of everything from the Terror to the de-Christianization campaigns to the trial of Marie Antoinette, you'll be able to better appreciate the polarizing views in which historians frame these events. And it's with this introduction complete that we can return to Paris in July 1793. With the Enraged battling the Jacobins, and with Marat's legacy up for grabs, Jacques Hébert prepared to ascend the revolutionary ladder. Proclaiming himself to be the true heir to Marat, he boldly volunteered to be the revolution's next victim. As the battle for the Republic escalated, history shows that Hébert was true to his word. Thank you for listening to episode 76, The Battle for the Sans-Culottes, Part 1. In the next episode, we'll see the pinnacle of the struggle between the Enraged and the Jacobins, as well as the rise of Robespierre to the Committee of Public Safety. But before you go, a reminder that this revolution needs your help. Grey History is only possible thanks to the support of listeners from all over the globe, 330 of them to be precise. If you're enjoying the show, please consider joining these revolutionaries and donating a cup of coffee when main narrative episodes are first released. For the price of just a humble coffee, you can do your bit to ensure that there's more Grey History waiting for you tomorrow, and enjoy all the exclusive perks that come with it. From the ad-free version of the show to hours upon hours of bonus content, there's much to enjoy, all while helping Grey History. There's links in the show notes and on the website, and please join the community today. One final welcome to the newest members of the show, and a special shout out again to the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Auger, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Fernando, Gilberto, Ron, and Kevin S. As always, thank you for listening, Thank you for your support. Stay safe and have a great day.